Welcome to the third, and this is the August meeting, even though it's September, of the Bourbon Barrel Task Force. Before we start, I want to welcome a few of my guests. I've got my county judge, my soon-to-be county judge, my sheriff. Everybody's here. I appreciate them all showing up. Dean like that. That's good. That's good. I want to take just a second and reiterate something, because Frankfort is a wonderful, wonderful place of misinformation. And I hear constantly, in fact, I heard this one driving up today. Have you read McCoy's pre-filed bill taking away the bourbon barrel tax? And somebody said yes. And I'm like, well, dadgum, I've not read McCoy's pre-filed bill taking away the bourbon barrel tax, so I'd love to see it. So I just want to say again, everybody out there, we are trying to find a way. There have been no decisions made. Nothing's been decided. We're trying to find a way to stop being the only entity in the world that taxes spirits in a barrel, and do that without hurting any of our counties, cities, taxing districts, authorities, and schools. So please understand that. That is our sole goal up here, which means I need everybody to get creative. I don't know if you guys ever did Governor Scholar or Future Problem Solving, in high school. That's the kind of thing we're here to do. What are the different options that are out there? What can we do creatively to not hurt anybody involved in this and continue to grow Kentucky in a proactive rather than reactive way? So that I will shut up. Madam Secretary, if you'll call the roll.
Senator Harper Angel. Senator Higdon. Here. Senator McDaniel. Here. Representative Decker. Representative Huff.
Here.
Representative Stevenson. President Stivers.
Here.
Chair McCoy.
Here. And could we have a motion on the minutes from our July meeting?
Motion.
And a second. Motion and a second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. So the first item on the agenda, Mr. Eifler, Stoll, Keenan, and Ogden, if you could please come to the table and talk to us about industrial revenue bonds, which sounds riveting. Can you hit the green button in front of you? Or that's not a green button, it's a black button.
Can you hear me?
There you are.
Okay.
Maybe pull that closer too so we get a good... there's tons of people at home watching and they can't hear unless that's on.
Thank you. And I do have a PowerPoint presentation I'm going to pull up here.
And members of the committee, we have the PowerPoint in front of us as well, hard copy.
Okay, thank you. Yes, my name's Tim Eifler. I'm a lawyer with Stoll Keenan in the Louisville office. We often represent the Kentucky distillers, and so they've asked me today to give basically just a general overview of industrial revenue bonds in one specific context, and that is the use of bonds as a mechanism to obtain a state and local property tax abatement. So bonds can be used for all kinds of different things, but today I just want to talk about that one specific instance because I think the speakers after me today are going to talk about the interplay with the abatement structure and what the task force is basically looking at with distilleries. Okay. So where I'm going today is I want to talk a little bit about what are industrial revenue bonds, the Kentucky statutes that govern their issuance, the statutes that govern how assets that are financed by industrial revenue bonds are taxed at both the state level and the local level, and then a little bit about the process to issue industrial revenue bonds, and finally some of the variables that come into play. Help me fix my PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just we're gonna make it the slide presentation mode right there.
Okay, thank you. Much better. Okay, so first let me begin with a little terminology. The word bond Sounds like it's something special and cryptic, but at the end of the day, bond is just an obligation or a promise. And in the context of borrowing funds, a bond is the obligation to repay that debt. So when we talk about industrial revenue bonds, we're really talking about a loan and an obligation to repay. So in Kentucky, we have a series of statutes in KRS Chapter 103. It's 103-200 to 103-285. And those statutes basically authorize certain governmental entities in Kentucky to issue industrial revenue bonds to finance certain projects. And those series of statutes contain a bunch of requirements on how it's to be done, the mechanics you go through, how different levels of government can be involved, and what type of assets can be financed with those bonds. Those statutes have actually been around a long time. Revenue bonds kind of came into being right after the end of World War II. Kentucky statutes date back to 1946. And as originally enacted, they were pretty narrow. They only authorized cities to issue these kind of bonds, and they were limited to financing manufacturing projects. Since 1946, the legislature has continually expanded these statutes, and most recently, in 2020, the General Assembly extended them again. The 2020 legislature basically extended the term, so now we can issue bonds. Instead of 30 years, they extended it to 40, maximum of 40 years of financing, which also means, from a property tax abatement standpoint, up to 40 years of an abatement. And they also clarified, or you all also clarified, that solar projects can qualify for industrial revenue bond financings. And there's a number of solar companies looking at Kentucky, so the legislature, there was no question they already qualified, but the legislature in 2020 confirmed again that even solar projects out in the state can qualify for bond financing. So,
Tim, if I could interrupt you real quick, Senator Higdon brought up a good point, and I just want
Sure.
to make it. The meeting materials are available on the LRC webpage under Special Committees, Bourbon Barrel Taxation Task Force. So if anybody out there is watching and wants to follow the PowerPoint. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. So the statutes authorize cities, counties, the Kentucky Economic Development and Finance Authority, which of course is a state agency, air boards, and river ports to issue these bonds. KEDFA has kind of an informal policy that they act as issuer only when a project involves multiple counties. They've got assets in multiple counties. So typically, for these kind of bonds, and when we're talking about property tax abatements, we're really talking about cities and counties being the issuers of those bonds. That's who we look to go get this incentive. And that's what it is. In this context, industrial revenue bonds are just another form of economic development incentive. We've got all the programs that KEDFA administers, the Tourism Development Finance Authority. Those are sort of state-level programs. This program is a little bit unique in that it is totally locally administered. So the city or the county has complete authority to decide whether or not it wants to provide this incentive for a project that's going to locate in its jurisdiction. And at the end of the day, this is simply a method, an alternative method, to finance the assets, the costs of a project, an economic development project in a jurisdiction that will allow for a property tax abatement, a reduction of the otherwise applicable property taxes on those assets during the term of the bonds, while the bonds are outstanding. And in order to get that abatement, we're going to kind of go through this a little bit more detail, you basically have to have a very specific structure. So all these bonds that are structured to provide these reduction in property taxes are structured the same way. And basically, title to the assets has to be held by the city or county during the term of the bonds. Those assets are leased to the company. The company gets use and access to those assets during the term of the bonds. And the bonds are issued to pay the cost of those assets, with the company's lease payments being used to repay the debt over the term of the bond. So it's a financing kind of routes through the city or county, but by putting title in the city or county's name and leasing it back, the Kentucky statutes, as the General Assembly has enacted, provide for a reduction in the otherwise applicable taxes that would apply to those assets. Okay. So now let's look at the statute. So KRS 103-210 confirms that industrial revenue bonds are there not for public projects. They're not there for school districts to build schools, to build county courthouses. These are a means for economic development for private industry in the jurisdiction. The statute provides that bonds can be issued to promote economic development, relieve conditions of unemployment, and encourage the increase of industry in the state. And the key definition is the bonds can be issued under the statutes only to finance an industrial building, and that's a defined term. And so only things that fit within that definition can qualify for a bond financing and also qualify for the abatement. So for any project we have when we're looking around the state, if we want to consider whether we might want to consider approaching city or county government for a property tax abatement, we have to see whether we can fit that project into one of these categories. If you can fit it into one of the categories, the assets that can be financed with the bonds are pretty broad. Land improvements, building, machinery or equipment. Critically, it's got to be a capital asset. So we're not talking about things that are expense. We're not talking about inventory. We're talking about assets with a long-term useful life. They're going to be there a long time. Those are the type of assets you can finance with bonds. There are 15 categories in that statute. It's KRS 103.200 is the statute with the definition, and it's got A through O subsections with different categories you can fit in, and it's a broad range of things. Obviously, manufacturing was there from the very beginning. It's the first subsection, but we've got mining, we've got hotels and motels, agricultural pursuits, lots of different broad categories. So on page, let's see here. On the next two pages, we've just listed some examples. You know, these bond issues are public issues. The KEDFA maintains a list of them as well. So you can find out where what companies have sought these bonds and obtained property tax abatements for their projects. And we just compiled a list on the next two pages just to show you the kind of the depth and breadth of the bond issues that are out there. We're talking about projects all over the state, projects that involve all kinds of different things. So we've got lots of distribution centers, some hotels, greenhouses, and then I think clearly the biggest category is manufacturing. I mean, we primarily see these being used to finance manufacturing projects, and it makes sense because out of all the projects, manufacturing typically requires the largest capital investment to undertake, the activity. So you're talking about a lot of taxable property potentially coming into the jurisdiction. A temporary abatement as an inducement to get that project to locate in the city or county is very meaningful for a manufacturer. So you'll see there are lots of them on here, and including distilleries. So under Kentucky law, distilleries are manufacturers. So industrial revenue bonds, like for any other manufacturer, are available to distilleries for their not only the distilling operation, but also the aging process, so the warehouses as well, if the city and the county decide they want to do that. Okay. So again, turning back to the statute, this is, again, the definition of industrial building. I just mentioned subsection A is the manufacturing category. That's the category that's relevant for distilleries. Anybody else engaged in manufacturing or assembling, that's the category they fit under, so they can use bonds for financing. But there's 14 other categories below that in the statute. Okay. So what are these bonds exactly? The technical term would be they are a conduit financing. And by that I mean, technically it's the city or county borrowing funds. They issue the bonds. They're on the bond document as the obligor to pay it. But they're just a conduit because at the end of the day, the money that's borrowed is distributed to the company to reimburse it for the cost of the assets for the project. And the money to repay the bonds are paid by the company in its rent payments to the bondholder to repay those bonds. So the city or county is in the middle. They're a conduit, but they're really not technically the borrower at the end of the day. And I say that because these are not general obligations. These are special obligations, and the sole source of repayment of these bonds is the company. and its rental stream. So if there's a default, the city or county is not on the hook for these bonds. They don't have an obligation to levy a tax to repay the bonds. The bondholder can only look to the company. And you say, well, why don't we just have a loan directly with the company? It's because that's the statutory scheme we have. It flows through local government to create the structure. And it's common in other states as well. Kentucky is not the only one that does this. A lot of the southern states have an identical system that this is used for a property tax abatement under this structure. So the debt itself, when it's borrowed, is secured by a pledge of the lease and the revenue stream from the company. In all the conversation, whenever we go to local government and give our presentation on our request for bonds, the key takeaway for the members of the fiscal court or the city council is that the bonds are not a general obligation of the city or county, not like when you borrow to build a city hall or a courthouse or something like that. They are not backed up by the credit of the issuer, the city or county. They're not backed up by a pledge of taxing authority. And by statute, and also there's case law on this, it is not considered a debt of the city or county for purposes of the limits on city and county borrowing. So Section 158 of the state constitution says, cities, counties, special taxing districts, you are capped at how much you're allowed to borrow. And that cap is a function of some percentage of the taxable value of property in your district. So the question often comes up, if we issue these bonds, is that going to, reduce our available borrowing capacity under that limit? And the answer is it does not. Because again, it's not truly an obligation of the city or county. It's just they're just a conduit. So it has no impact on that. And finally, at the bottom of this slide, now the term of these bonds is 40 years. For a long time, it was 30. So the legislature 2 years ago decided to make these available for an even longer period of time. And again, that's a maximum term. So cities and counties may decide, I'm going to finance this project, but I'm only going to do it for 20 years or 10 years. Everything is negotiable. The statute just sets a procedure and basically caps on what can and can't be done. Okay, so how does the abatement work? So basically, what we do in the bond issue is we separate the different interests in an asset to obtain different tax treatment. So, if I own a piece of property, I have title to it, and I also have the right to use it. If I lease it to someone else, I have title to it, but someone else has the right to use it. I've shifted that piece of the overall bundle of sticks on property ownership to someone else. In the bond structure, what we do is we transfer title, ownership of the assets to the city or county that's going to issue those bonds, and then they lease the asset back to the company. And under Kentucky property tax law, that creates two potentially taxable interests in the property. One is the fee title, and the other is the leasehold. Fee title is owned by the city or county. Company retains the leasehold, and we have statutes that say that in the context of a bond issue, we have specific rules on how those are going to be treated for state and local property tax purposes. So on this page, we quote from 103.285. That's a statute within the bond statutes, and it basically says all properties, real and personal, which a city or county acquires to be rented to an industrial concern under these bond statutes is exempt from tax to the same extent as other public property used for public purposes. So Jennifer Hayes, a couple of meetings ago, had an overview of Kentucky's state constitutional provisions governing property tax. And one of those provisions is Section 170, which lists a bunch of different exemptions. And one of those exemptions is public property used for public purposes. So the legislature in this statute is simply confirming that while the city or county owns that asset, it's taxed just like all other public property, and that is it's not taxed, it's exempt. So the fee title, the ownership to those assets under a bond issue, is not subject to state or local property tax during the term of the bonds. The company's leasehold interest in those assets is taxed in a kind of an unusual fashion. So we do have some statutes that basically say in Kentucky, if if I lease if I'm a private business, private person, and I lease an asset from an otherwise tax exempt entity, whether that's the government, might be a charity. If I lease their asset, we have statutes that say it's KRS 132, 195, and I think 193 say that the leasehold interest is taxable. The fee interest is exempt, but we're going to make the leasehold interest taxable if it has its own value. So to deal with kind of that rule in the context of bonds, what the legislature has said is that we're going to carve leasehold interest and bonds out. We're going to give them special treatment. And basically, in a series of statutes, we have provided that leasehold interest is completely exempt from local property tax. So during the term of the bonds, the fee title interest is exempt, and the company, which has a leasehold interest, doesn't owe any property tax to any local government in Kentucky, local including schools. It's exempt. For state property tax purposes, the rules have sort of changed over time. Originally, automatically, when you set up your bond issue, the leasehold interest was subject to state tax at a really, really low rate, 1.5 cents per hundred. Back in 2002, the legislature decided we want to have some oversight over that process because you have cities and counties issuing bonds and impacting the state's revenue stream by doing so. So in 2002, the legislature changed the statute to say in order for the state rate to be reduced, KEDFA has to approve it. So since 2002, we have this application process. So we go to the city and county, they issue the bonds, we automatically get the local exemption. The fee title ownership interest in the assets automatically exempt from state property tax, but the company's leasehold interest is subject to regular property tax rates at the state level only unless we file an application and KEDFA approves it. And then the rate is reduced down to 1.5 cents. So at the end of the day, in the best of all worlds, the bonds provide the company an up to 40-year abatement of property taxes on the assets that are financed by the bonds and held by the city or county. Instead of paying full state and local property taxes on those assets, the company is paying a very low state-only property tax rate. And that's why it's so beneficial when companies want it. It's an incentive, just like going and getting KBI or Kia incentives. It's a temporary abatement, and it's something that cities and counties can offer businesses as an incentive for them to locate in their county as opposed to locate in another state, somewhere else. It's just another arrow in the quiver of economic development. But what's a little bit unique is it's something that's totally locally controlled. So the city or the county has the discretion to decide whether they want to offer it. Okay, so let's talk about the process. And I thought here, since we are talking about distilleries, it might be good just to walk through a distillery example or barrel warehouses. So the only real procedural provision in the bond statutes is KRS 103.210, which is quoted at the top of this page, says that before you can issue bonds and borrow money, the city or county, the issuer, has to adopt an ordinance or resolution that has to basically explain to the public what's the undertaking, what's the project that's being considered for the jurisdiction, what's the maximum amount of bonds that are going to be outstanding, what's the maximum interest rate on these bonds. So we call that the bond ordinance. It says here bond inducement resolution, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. But basically, you have to adopt an ordinance or a resolution with all these things in it. It has to be published. Only then under the statute can you issue these bonds. So that's the statutory requirement. The practical side of this is in pretty much every one of these bond issues that we're involved in, what happens is our client comes to us and says, we're considering a project in somewhere in Kentucky, perhaps, or in multiple Kentucky and surrounding states. And what incentives are available? And one of the incentives we'll look at is industrial revenue bonds. So if we've got a distillery that's looking to locate in Kentucky, or an existing distillery in Kentucky that's trying to figure out where they want to put their next barrel warehouse, one of the things we'll look at is let's consider industrial revenue bonds. And sort of step one, which we do at the same time we're reaching out to the Cabinet for Economic Development, So we'll reach out to the mayor, the county judge, typically the city attorney and the county attorney, and begin discussions about an industrial revenue bond. Really, step one is we have to get a resolution. So at the same time that KEDFA's making its announcement for the project, we're getting a city council or a fiscal court to adopt a resolution, what we call a bond inducement resolution, that says we understand this company is considering locating this project in our county. It's going to involve capital expenditures up to X amount. It's going to create economic development opportunities in the county or in the city. We agree at the appropriate time as an inducement to get them to undertake the project to issue bonds up to X amount to finance the cost of that project. So the company gets that bond inducement resolution, and you say, well, why are you doing that? Well, for certain types of bonds, you have to get it, and that's really driven by federal income tax law, not relevant here. But we like to get it because we want to show, and certainly city and county want to show, that they took action that caused this company to undertake its project. They were at the table, and they agreed to offer this in order to get the company to make its investment in their jurisdiction, just like any other economic development incentive. So we get that resolution, and then timing can work a bunch of different ways, but kind of the simplest way to do it is the company then buys its land, builds its distillery, builds its warehouses. So once it's kind of ready to put the project in service, we then go back to the city or county, city council, fiscal court, and we say, okay, we did what we said we were going to do. We're ready to issue the bonds. So at that point in time, then the city or county complies with this statute and adopts the bond ordinance. And the bond ordinance is the kind of formal document that says we, the city council, the fiscal court, are authorizing this borrowing. We're authorizing the sale of the bonds. We're going to set a maximum cap on the interest rate, set the amount, specify the project, and then critically, we're going to approve the execution of all the bond documents. So if anybody's been through a bond issue, they're horribly paper intensive. There's lots and lots of documents. So that's all kind of being done in the background by bond counsel. But that city or county action authorizes the sale of bonds. Once that's done, we have a closing like in any other loan transaction where you're going to get funded. And at the closing, a whole bunch of things happen at once, and they're all listed here on page 10. But basically, we need to set up this bond structure, which the statutes say we have to have in order to get this property tax abatement. So the company who's already bought these assets probably had construction financing during the term before the bonds are issued. They're going to transfer the real estate and the equipment that are going to be financed by the bonds to the city or county. So we'll have a deed and we'll have a bill of sale. The city or county, once they get title, they'll sign a lease agreement leasing those assets back to the company during the term of the bonds. Those two the deed and the lease agreement are recorded with the county clerk, like all the real estate records. And then the bonds are sold. So we may have a bank that buys them. We may market them out in the public with an underwriter. Or a lot of times on these, we may have an affiliate of the company buy the bonds. They'll borrow it from their parent company through the context of having the parent company buy the bonds to finance the project. Either way, there's a funding. And so that amount is then paid to the company, and the company uses that to pay off its construction loan, perhaps, or just reimburse itself for all the costs of the construction. And so once we're done with that, the bond structure is in place. And then over that up to 40-year period, the company's going to be making lease payments, and those lease payments are going to equal the amounts that are due for the periodic payments on the bonds annually. Typically, the money doesn't flow through local government. It either is paid directly between the two, the company and the bondholder, or if there's a bond indenture, we may have a bank in the middle that serves as a trustee. Those funds will flow through that institution, but the county is not, even though they are the conduit, they're not receiving these flows of funds. And so that's the structure during the term of the bonds. And then after the bonds are paid off and terminate, the abatement ends. So Kentucky law, and there's a bunch of cases that have been litigated on this in Kentucky. In order for the abatement to apply, the assets have to be financed, meaning the debt has to be outstanding. So as soon as you pay off the bonds, it becomes fully taxable, even if the city or county still owns it. But typically, it all happens at the same time. We paid off the bonds. We'll have some provision in the lease agreement for some nominal payment to be made by the company at that point in time to the city or county. And then they'll do a deed or a bill of sale or both, conveying title to the assets back to the company. The abatement ends, the bond issue ends, and all those assets go back onto the regular state and local property tax rolls. So the next couple pages here, I'll just quickly go through. These are just graphical representations of each of these steps. So, the most complicated step is the closing. So here we've got the city or county is the issuer on this sheet, the bond purchasers, who's providing the funding, buying the bonds. Company's going to transfer title, it's going to lease it back. The city or county is going to sell the bonds to the bond purchaser, and the bond purchaser is going to pay the cost, the purchase price, to the company to reimburse for the cost of the project. And then we have our annual payments between the company and the bond purchaser, lease payments and bond payments, which match. And then finally at maturity, bonds are paid off and title to the project reverts to the company. Now the last part of this relates to how is this administered. So Kentucky has a system in place to deal with, if we're going to offer this incentive, we have to have ways to report all this, properly value it, properly tax it, just like we do for regular assets under the regular property tax. So mechanically what happens, and typically we will work with the PVAs when we do one of these to make sure they've got all the information they need, know how this is going to work, know how much money's been spent, how much has been drawn on the bonds. But basically, if we're talking about real estate, when the company at the closing transfers title to the city or county with the deed gets recorded. Kentucky has a statute that says a copy of all deeds recorded with the county clerk gets sent to the PVA. So the PVA gets a copy of that deed, sees now the title is going to be held by a governmental entity, will code that property as non-taxable, exempt governmental property, takes it off the city and county tax rolls. In our experience, what most PVAs will do is they'll also create a new parcel that's the leasehold. So the company does have a taxable leasehold interest during the term of the bonds, and so on the real property tax roll, they will have a separate entry that allows them every year to value that leasehold interest, which, as we talked about, continues to be subject to state property tax and at full rate unless KEDFA has approved the rate reduction. Kentucky law requires that all property that's subject to property tax has to be listed. So the listing is done in two ways. When we record the lease agreement, which has to be recorded, we list the company's taxable leasehold interests and all the machinery and equipment, the tangible personal property. The Department of Revenue has provided a schedule on the annual tangible personal property tax return where you can report bond-financed assets. For distilleries, that's true as well. So same thing for the land and the building. The one variable with distilleries is some distilleries apparently in some of their bond issues have included barrels. So not the liquid inside the barrel, but the container, because the liquid's inventory, the container is a depreciable asset, so it can be financed. So on the distilled spirits tax return, there is a mechanism for distilleries to report barrels that have been financed under an industrial revenue bond. But at the end of the day, the juice, the distillate, is fully taxable, and bonds don't impact that in any way. And that's the bulk of the value that's taxed under the distilled spirits tax. Okay, a few other considerations. Pilots. Pilot is a payment in lieu of tax. You won't find anything about it in the statutes, and basically it's something that can be negotiated as part of a bond issue. It's a contractually required payment stream. So if we go to the city or county and we want them to abate property taxes through this bond issue, the issuer, the city or county, may say, well, we're going to want some payment in return, because by issuing the bonds, we completely remove the assets from the local tax rolls. So we want you to enter into a pilot agreement when the bonds are issued that require X payments, whether it's to the city, the county, may go to a fire district if there's special fire needs, or a lot of times to the school district. during the term of the bond. So that becomes one of the bond documents that are executed at closing. But critically, it's a variable. It's all over the place. It's whatever is negotiated. It's whatever the issuer wants to require. So that's just a consideration that comes into play. And then finally, KEDFA approval. Again, 2002, the legislature gave KEDFA part of the process here. So before a city or county, by issuing a bond, is going to impact the state property tax revenue stream, KEDFA has to weigh in and approve it. So a city or county can't just issue bonds and give away basically or abate state property taxes without KEDFA's approval. And there's an application process for that. The city, the issuer of the bond, city or county, and the company jointly file the application. KEDFA reviews those at its monthly meetings. And there's some informal guidelines that KEDFA has published out on the internet that govern kind of what they look at in considering the approval. Just like their other incentive programs, they're going to look at jobs, wages, capital investment, where the project's located, what's the county unemployment rate. Those all go into play. And then kind of most critical for a lot of the projects we work on, they do have some hard and fast rules on pilot payments. So if you want to go to the state, you want to go to KEDFA and get approval for the state rate reduction, KEDFA's current policy is that the company has to agree to a full school pilot agreement as part of the issuance. So that means basically that even though we're going to remove the assets from the local tax roll, the company has to agree that it will pay the same amount it otherwise would have paid to the school district annually if the bonds hadn't been issued, as a condition for KEDFA agreeing to the state rate reduction. And then they have some other policies that basically say if there's some other pilots beyond the schools that are required by the issuer, the state's going to match that. So if the city is issuing the bonds and the city says, we want you to pay us a 50% pilot, KEDFA is going to require a 50% state pilot to match that. So there are some kind of guardrails on the ability of cities or counties to impact state revenues with these bonds. And that's basically it in a nutshell. I'm happy to answer any questions.
First question is, can we get CLE credit for this?
Yeah, right.
That was like pretty
exactly.
intense.
We should petition.
I'm going to.
Yeah.
All right, President Stivers, I think you had some comment.
Yeah, I want to just try to walk through this in a non-lawyer way. And I'm going to use Jim Beam in my hometown. So there's 500 acres that Jim Beam wants to come to Manchester, Kentucky. And what happens there is the city buys the property from Chad McCoy. I'm glad to know you had a draft bill that you didn't show me. We're just joking. So the city buys it for $2 million. And then Jim Beam walks in and spends $8 million building rick houses and distilleries. So the overall bond issue is $10 million that the city, which doesn't go against their bonding capacity, has basically bought the property, built the rick houses and the distillery, and for $800,000 a year over the next 20 years that Beam will pay them, that will retire their debt issue. At that point in time, there would be some type of nominal $100,000 deed transacted, City of Manchester deeds it to Jim Beam, and they own it. But for that 20-year period, because it is a governmental entity, under 170s in the Constitution, it's a non-taxable piece of property for the realty and added value of the construction. And that's right, where the distillery or the company gets its tax advantage on this type of transaction. But if you have what you called, what was it just then? The last term you used, pilot.
Oh, yes.
They could negotiate some type of additional payment for local entities to receive what they may not or what they would have received if it had been a direct transaction between Jim Beam and Chad McCoy. Is that what that is? That's kind of what you've run through?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so the key, remember, we're talking about the delta, right? The margins here. So if a company's already there, if the distillery's already there and their property's on the tax roll, that asset remains. It continues to be taxed. We're not impacting that revenue stream. We're basically saying if the company's going to spend, $10 million to expand, these are things that are not in the current tax base currently, and we would like, as an inducement, a temporary exemption on those assets.
I've started anew. That's my second point. Now, it's there. It's already in Manchester, and they want to do 20 more rick houses. They can do the same type of bond with the city of Manchester to build those, even though it's on the Jim Beam property.
That's correct.
You just wouldn't pay for the added value to, basically it's valued at X without the additional rick houses. It's going to be X plus the rick houses, but you avoid the taxation on the new construction.
That's right.
The property taxation.
That's correct. So you take that added value, it exists, it just doesn't go into the local, state and local tax base, or it's impacted by the bonds.
Well, it's exempted.
Yeah.
Okay.
Senator Higdon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess we talk about that these bonds are good up to 40 years. Of course, today we're talking about bourbon warehouses. What's the typical length of these bonds do you see in the bourbon industry?
Well, so, the duration just changed. We typically would see 30 years. And so they went from 30 to 40 in the statute in 2020. So we have been seeing a lot of 40-year bond issues now since the statute was amended. I can't speak for the industry and what they're, on all these expansions that are going on. But I'd say at least through 2020, our experience would be a 30-year bond issue for the distillers.
Okay, and on these IRBs and all that goes into, they're legally binding for the length for the term of the bond on both parties. Is there escape clauses in there for any reasons?
Well, so it's a contract, so you can negotiate anything. Like we have seen things in the past where, not really for distillers, but sometimes we'll see new industries where the issuer might put an obligation in there that if the company vacates a location, we're going to terminate the bonds. The city has an option, kind of a protection for the city or the county. You sometimes will see things like that. The company will often have a right to terminate the bond. So the bond documents will provide a right for the company to pay off the bonds at any time. And then once they pay off the bonds, they automatically will terminate. So the company certainly has that right. But otherwise, that's kind of the universe of what we see on things like that.
Okay, then on the pilots, on that last slide, it talked about that KITFA requires state pilots to match pilots paid to other local taxing districts. Now, is that a revenue for the state or liability for the state? I'm having trouble following you on that one.
Sure. So when the bonds are issued, let me put it this way. So KEDFA will agree to the state rate reduction if there's a full school pilot. So let's say it's, for regular tangible personal property, the state rate is 45 cents per 100. If we had a bond issue financing regular tangible personal property, we go to KEDFA. KEDFA will, if you have a full school pilot agreement in place, they'll agree to reduce the state rate from 45 cents down to 1.50 cents. However, if you also are required, the company are also required to make some pilot payment to somebody else, whether it's the issuer, the city, or the county, or might be to a fire district. If there's some other district getting some payment, then KEDFA will match it. So KEDFA reduces the rate to 1.5 cents, but let's say we had a fire district that we agreed to make a 50% pilot to. KEDFA would require the company to enter into a pilot agreement with the state to pay additional revenues to the state to raise that back up to the equivalent of 50% of the otherwise available rate, the 45-cent rate, because it automatically goes to 1.5 cents. So for the state to get more money back after they've reduced the rate, they do it through a separate pilot agreement with the Department of Revenue.
And thank you. And Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, you recognized some of your folks. I have a looking out in the audience, a lot of folks very interested in this issue from my district, and I just want to thank them all for attending today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Chairman McDaniel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Tim, thank you for the presentation today. First of all, is this IRB structure unique to the Commonwealth?
No, South Carolina and Georgia, I know, have virtually identical structures. Tennessee does something similar, that where there's basically title is sort of parked with cities and counties to provide a local property tax abatement. There are a lot of southern states that have a similar structure.
Okay, thank you. Secondly, can the Commonwealth itself issue conduit bonds?
KEDFA, under this statute, has the right to issue these.
Obviously, they wouldn't be GO bonds.
Correct.
Because we can't do
That's
that.
Right.
But if an organization, a company, defaults on the payments of the bonds, you mentioned that there's no recourse to the issuer. But in the event of a default, does that in any way negatively impact the rating of that issuer in the future when they take a future IRB to sale?
I don't know of any defaults I could give an exact example on, but I would say the way underwriters look at things from a credit standpoint, when they look at these IRBs, they know that the sole source of repayment that was pledged is the revenue stream of the company. So the city or the county is not offering anything as collateral for the repayment. So based on that, it shouldn't have any impact on the city or county on its ability to borrow, for example, GO bonds.
But you can see where potentially if a county issued to an organization and then that organization should have defaulted on their IRBs down the line, and the county wanted to issue for somebody in the future, would the market look at the issuer with any kind of a jaded eye, as in, man, they didn't do their due diligence last time we got burned in this deal? Have you experienced anything like that?
So you're talking about future revenue bonds being issued?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the answer to that would be no, because if you do actually market your bonds to the public, from an underwriting standpoint, they're not looking at the city or county. They're looking at who the company is, because that's the sole source of repayment. So in a future bond issue, they're going to look at whoever it is who's the ultimate company there, who's providing that revenue stream. And they may say, we don't think that company's creditworthy. We want some kind of credit enhancement. We may want a letter of credit, bond insurance, things like that. But those all relate to the creditworthiness of the private user, the company, not the issuer.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other members with a question before I ask a couple? Tim, thanks for this info. A couple things I just want to make sure I heard right. During the time the bonds are outstanding, the real property, which is titled by the government entity, is exempt from real property tax. The leasehold is exempt from local property tax, might have the state issue and whether KEDFA is going to reduce it. The juice, the barrels, is the bourbon barrel tax still being collected though?
Usually it is. I think we understand, I haven't been involved in one of these, but I understand in some bond issues, the barrel itself, the container, is included. So if that's the case, that means the container would be exempt, just like the other assets. But the juice itself, which is the bulk of the value that's subject to tax under the barrel tax is not part of the bond issue, and it's still fully taxable.
So during the 30 years or 40 years, the counties are still collecting, all the local taxing districts are still collecting, the schools are still getting all of the barrel tax.
Correct.
Okay. And this is obviously a voluntary thing. Nobody has to do one of these, right?
Correct.
So what's the upside to a city or a county to do one of these, knowing that they're going to be giving up the real property tax over the time period?
Sure. So there are lots of things that go into that analysis. It's really no different than what KEDFA looks at for projects. So obviously, we want economic development in the state. We want growth, and so we're with our state programs and with this program, we're willing sometimes to offer incentives to get somebody to make that investment. Realize we're giving up something early on, but we're going to get it in return. So, part of the analysis is if you make, let's say for a lot of these distillery projects, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. If you're going to make $100 million investment in my community, 40 years from now, that investment's still going to be there. And I've got you, and I've got all these new jobs you've created. So there's that, and there's the ripple effect in the local economy. There are some other revenue streams that local government does get. If you have an occupational tax in the jurisdiction, you've got the wages. During the construction phase, usually in every project, there's a big kind of, if you look at it on a graph, there's a big bump at the very beginning of these where you've got all this construction labor. So during the construction phase, these companies are hiring general contractors, bringing folks in. Those workers, while they're working there, if you have an occupational tax, you're going to see quite a bit of additional revenue during the construction phase. And then once that's over, the new jobs created are subject to that local occupational tax. And you've got that wage stream. You've got insurance premiums taxes. You might have utility, gross receipts, license taxes for the schools. So there's a lot of other things that go into the analysis, and what we find is there's a lot of discussion about that. So when we bring up a bond issue, the local government wants to say, well, what are we getting out of this? What does this mean for us? So we typically do look at these other revenue streams and see what they're going to mean to local government. Sometimes, and Kentucky actually has a program for this at the state level. Sometimes we're worried about this business picking up and moving somewhere else because it's a lot cheaper to do business in that jurisdiction than here. So we're going to offer these incentives because we want to, partner with the business and keep those activities here. We don't want them to begin having warehouses in some other jurisdiction, for example. So, I can't say it's one thing or another, but all those factors kind of go into the analysis. But at the end of the day, we've got our political representatives there, and they get to make the call because we're not entitled to this. This is something that the city or the county governing board has to agree to do, and they're not required to do it.
Are these third-party three-player contracts? Is the government entity signing on to the bond indentures and all the agreements? And
Yes.
In your experience, this is not what's going to happen. I'm just asking a hypothetical question, but I want to ask the question. If tomorrow the barrel tax went away, we just jerked it out, would that breach any of the bond documents that you've ever seen? Would that be some sort of an ex post facto issue from a government standpoint?
No. Obviously, government can contract its taxing authority, and there's plenty of Kentucky case law along those lines. I can't just go to local government and say, I want you to contractually agree not to charge this tax, or contractually agree that you will continue to charge this tax in the future. The law is what it is on things like that. So the bond issue kind of wraps around the existing structure, but there's nothing in there that contractually obligates a tax to remain in place or obligates a local government, let's say, to not levy a tax. So it wouldn't be a breach. It might impact expectations, and that's clearly, obviously, something that this task force is going to consider. But legally, there would be no prohibition on a change in the law like that.
Great. Thank you, Senator McDaniel.
Tim, if you purchase an IRB, is the interest taxed as capital gains? The interest paid to the purchaser, is that taxed at a capital gains rate, or the gain on the bond proceeds?
So if the existing bondholder sells the bond,
Yeah, no. When the bond holder buys the bond, if you hold it through maturity, obviously you have a gain on the sale.
well, if you hold it through maturity, you're basically receiving it's a loan. It's no different than when the bank loans you money.
Right, and
We're
you
calling
as
it a
the-
bond, but all the bank's receiving is repayment of principal and interest. So
And
there's
correct. So how is the
interest over time.
Is the interest treated under the capital gains rate?
no, it's treated as ordinary income.
It's treated as ordinary income. So is there any particular prohibition on an affiliate of the underlying company from purchasing the IRB debt?
No.
Do we know how often that's done or not?
On property tax abatement bonds, I think it's pretty common. It's fairly common.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Anybody else on the committee with a question? Representative Decker. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your presentation. Very thorough. Watched it on YouTube until I got here. But how frequent are the pilots? Do you know that people enter the pilots, or the entities do?
How frequent are they required, or how often do people make payments under their existing payments?
Make payments under their, or how often are they both? Both questions.
Yeah. So, as far as required, it's kind of all over the place. Because every project's different, everything's negotiable. It's not unusual to have a pilot agreement, and it's not unusual to have some payment stream, it seems like, to school districts. That seems to be a fairly frequent requirement, and how much that is and how it's calculated is kind of different for every jurisdiction. Typically, if you have a pilot agreement, there are annual payments that kind of mirror when the property taxes would have normally been paid. So typically, if you have a pilot obligation, it's either being paid to the issuer or it might be paid to the school district, and it's paid right about the same time that property tax payments are due.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Seeing no other questions, you're temporarily excused, subject to recall, but I appreciate what you've
Thank you.
testified to up here. Next up, item number 4 on the agenda, discussion of county concerns. Mr. Henderson and Mr. Summers, please come on up. If you would, when you have a seat, make sure the little green light's on. Introduce yourself for the record.
I'll do the introductions here. Good morning, Jim Henderson with the Kentucky Association of Counties, and I'll also introduce one of our policy people on staff, Kayla Carter, who's here to help a little bit if needed on the technology and maybe questions. So, Judge Summers.
To Jim Beam. The distiller, he was unmatched with this community service that separates Jerry Summers from the rest of the industry. So this is why I'm here today. I'd like to chat with y'all for a few minutes about, Kayla, if you'd show the first slide, please. This is the revenue impact just in Bullitt County alone on our the Department of Revenue wasn't real forthcoming about how many barrels exactly Jim Beam and Four Roses has. And when I was in the industry, I had the right to be able to see all that at one time. But now, apparently, as an elected official, you don't have that right without a confidentiality agreement. So in our community, you can see that the Southeast Fire District, and this is just in last year's taxing district on the ad valorem, it was $360,000 to a fire department. It's literally across the street. And if the ad valorem tax isn't piloted or subsidized, that fire district will go away. It's a class 4 out of when you go through 1 through 10 fire protection. You can see in our fiscal court, we're the next largest recipient of it. And to help you with that revenue that we received from that. Last year alone, to repair the roads, for the construction for the distilleries in our community, we spent close to $350,000 out of our general fund to reconstruct the county roads. And again, a state road right now will need the same type of reconstruction again as it was literally a year ago from the construction of Bourbon warehouses. We'll bounce down into here that on our tax revenue, we're expected to double by 2026. Because when you look at the expansion of Four Roses, you're talking 24,000 barrels in 17 warehouses, and Jim Beam with another 15, averaging from 50 to 58,000 barrels apiece. So this funding goes a long ways in our community towards supplying the much-needed services to support this industry as well. You can see the impact to the schools. I think they were on WDRB yesterday. It was 2.6 million. And what you do have to remember, and members, what I want you all to look at is this. There's a big hole missing here. There's nothing coming back to the state. This is strictly a local tax, a tax to support this industry in our community, a community that is given back. We have no occupational tax. On the insurance premium surcharge, these companies are foreign held. They're self-insured, so we get no revenue from that either. We have no licensing fee for their cocktails or their visitor experiences. We have to provide emergency services to them quite frequently because of the amount of land that they do own and across the street from Bernheim Forest. So where we are at with this, I sit here and I firmly believe that this would be an undue burden on my 85,000 residents of my community to be able to have to subsidize an industry that's doing so well, whether it's to make things neutral or whole, or even giving it up one way or the other. I would like to talk about, to answer some, if I can, Chairman, some of your questions about pilot programs and industrial revenue bonds, of which I'm familiar with. I want you to take a look at this. This is how many revenue bonds and the value of them that's been issued to the industry that we have to date. My colleagues are here from both Nelson and Marion counties as well. And this affects not only our communities, but this is what communities have done to support this industry, to keep it here in Kentucky, to keep it viable and moving forward as we should. And when you talk about the 28 million or whatever acronym, the dollars that you all are putting on this all the way around to subsidize, it's not about that. It's about the investment that we have made as communities for the future growth to come back to us. You talk about the juice in the barrel. Let's just get right down to the distilling part of it if you want to. So that's our return on our investment. We gave up property taxes for 30 years, but yet we expect something back in return for that investment. You have jobs. I guess Senator Stivers, if I can drill down this deep into this, when you talk about jobs and what you all did in 2013, we haven't seen that until this last year. So this is where we stand with it. I have quite a few colleagues here who have done the same thing. They've given up their industrial parks, reduced rates to make this industry whole. And we're not here to hurt this industry. We're here to let you know that we have worked with them hand in hand to keep them viable, to keep them moving forward, and to be a big part of Kentucky, and to make it truly a signature industry. But to me, this is a pittance. You know, if a 15,000 barrel of liquor is going to go down to $10,000, that would be pretty cool. But I don't see this happening because most of these companies are held by companies that are in Italy, France, Great Britain, Canada, private investment firms. So I don't see the revenue stream coming back for opportunities here in our state. And I'm going to leave that at that because I could sit here and talk about this industry for 40 years because I have been in it that long and longer than that as well because of my family and what they had invested in moving from American Tobacco to Jim Beam. So I'll be happy to entertain any type of questions or an educational process on this in the industry. I'm disappointed that Eric Gregory's not here today, or some of the others. I see they've got all their lobbyists here, but I would like to chat with them. Jim, and please take what I'm saying in the right way. We're here to help this industry, but we do want to be made whole, because when you look at 2.6 billion in industrial revenue bonds, that's quite a pat on the back to be able to make this industry move forward.
Thank you for those comments. We do have one question, Senator
Sure.
McDaniel.
As is always the case, Mr. Chairman, I doubt I'll limit it to one, but one questioner. How's that? Judge, first of all, thank you for being here. Secondly, on your number on slide 3 there, total financial incentive, that's the bond amount, correct?
Yes.
Do you know the corresponding annual unrealized property tax revenue by county?
Sure. Well, I can by our county. I cannot speak for it for Nelson or Marion County as well, but I can by our county. And I don't have that number with me.
If you
but I
could
can
just,
provide
if
it.
we could find that out, and I don't
Yes,
mean
sir.
just for the county, but all the various districts that would count on that, if we could find that out, please. And you made an interesting comment that I want to ask you to expand
Sure.
on just a little bit.
I will.
Because a lot of times we make decisions that, they flow downhill to an extent. And I'm not a fan of the idea of some kind of a hold harmless that hits the Commonwealth's general fund. So that being said, to you as a judge, when you and your county commission decided to issue these conduit bonds, you made a calculation that, yes, we would forego these property taxes, but, and I'm assuming the companies emphasized this to you, there would be some type of a revenue stream to the county through the bourbon barrel tax. Is that accurate?
For clarification, my administration had no obligation to this bond. It was done previously.
Or
But
the
anyway, yes,
historic administration of Bullitt County. How's
Yes,
about that?
yeah, and yes, there is and there was, and the devil's in the detail with the pilot part of it as well, because it goes back into the school system to help to keep them whole, and the barrels, and this is what I'm so confused over, why the barrel itself, the state says it's personal property, where the industry capitalizes it, and the capitalization of the barrel is that's a huge. Let's put it this way: when you're putting up 1 million new barrels a year, that is a lot of, and that's just for a company. That's not for the entire Commonwealth. That's one heck of a capital expense, and for tax credits and on the IRBs as well.
Right. So you would consider it, in the event that this was just unilaterally wiped out. And I'm going to one extreme here. I understand that.
Right.
Okay. But you would view that as a one-sided sleight of hand based off of the original IRB issuance agreement.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Judge,
Yes.
Senator Higdon, did you have a question?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Now, just a comment I was going to share with you. I'm sure I'm not covered under any HIPAA laws, but Eric Gregory did share with me that he had COVID and wouldn't
Okay.
be here today. So I just wanted to, since you mentioned him, to throw that out there. Thank you.
Thank you,
That's
Senator. I was
okay.
actually going to bring that up. He had written to me as well, and I didn't want to announce it without his permission, but he since you brought it up, wanted to make sure everybody understood. Just a point of clarification on the slide that's up on the screen, and I think Chairman McDaniel asked this. I just want to make sure I understood it. The $585 million total financial incentive of the IRB, I'm just looking at the top one, Bullitt County Jim Beam. Is that the amount of the bond issuance?
That's the amount of the bond issuance.
Okay, so, and if I understood, and Tim, correct this if this is wrong, so that was a $585 million loan that the county had zero recourse on, was not financially on the hook for any part of, and really gave up nothing to do that, other than the property taxes. So that's what we need to see is what is the amount of the property tax over those 30 or 40 years, whatever it is.
Sure, and I have it in a real nice Excel spreadsheet.
Awesome. Do you have
Yeah,
it just
we
for
have-
Bullitt County or all the other counties?
No, I have it just for Bullitt County.
Okay.
And yes.
All right.
I have-
So really, this 2.5 billion represents the investment that the industry has made over this time period. We needed a little bit more to see what the counties gave up to get it. Is that
Sure.
accurate?
Yes, and that would be, and we would like to have another opportunity to explain that in the detail too.
Okay. I was hoping you'd come today with it, but go ahead. And Mr. Henderson, if you
Yeah,
if
and
you're
I may
ready.
touch on a little bit of that
Please.
more broadly. So, thank you for having us here. I have to write things down. I don't have a great internal clock, so a few comments here maybe, but I'll try to piggyback off of some of the things that Judge Summers said and Tim. And Judge Summers has a unique role here among county officials as maybe the only county judge who spent their private career in the bourbon industry. So his perspective certainly is one that is different from having known the inside of the business. But I do appreciate you all taking time to hear the county voice today. The county voice is different in different places. You know, I've said before here, kind of a mantra of counties across the country is when you've seen one county, you've seen one county. There just are different circumstances in each county. I do also want to make sure that we don't miss something that maybe isn't so obvious, but I think we all agree that we really love Kentucky bourbon, okay? I mean, the counties that are involved in the bourbon industry, they have known this industry and have lived this industry for many decades. And the bourbon culture is huge for Kentucky. It plays a large part, and I think the explosive expansion of it over the last couple of decades. I'm sure you, just like me, when you interact with people from other states as well as other countries, I think President Stivers is pretty close to right on the signature industry definition. This is the thing that people identify with us. So again, I think we're all interested in seeing Kentucky bourbon stay strong and remain a definition of who we are as Kentucky. And Tim Eifler, right? I said, yeah. Mm-hmm. He actually did a bond for us, the last big project I got to work on in Simpson County with a German automotive company that came, Fritz Winter, about a $200 million project. And when that project got down to a few sites, and we were in that hunt for about 2 years, and it got down to us and a site in Georgia, you know, one of the things that really tipped the scales for that industry to come to Kentucky was really our culture. I mean, when all things are equal, there just is something appealing about the horse industry, about the bourbon culture, and it drives decision making. So again, I think we all understand that. Again, counties have invested in the bourbon industry because they believe in it, and it's good for the county, and it's good for the community, and it's good for the state. But you know, what's interesting in this conversation that it is fairly new. I mean, it's one that I've only heard about more recently. I know other people have said this has been talked about a lot, but you know, when I was involved with local industry at home, and I would say the bourbon counties would be the same, you know, most of those issues that came up in terms of challenges on workforce or issues with taxation issues or impediments that they saw to being successful, those first conversations oftentimes occurred with the county officials, the industrial and development folks in the counties, and we just have not heard that, or at least I have not heard it, and county officials that I've talked to haven't heard that mentioned in the way in which I know it's been discussed maybe in this task force and even in the last session some, as being as large as it's being talked about today. I don't deny or doubt that it's of interest, but we just have not heard that in the same way that maybe you all have. In fact, to maybe the earlier questions about the IRBs and things, the contrast or the other side of that is actually the case in many times where that barrel tax is used and talked about as a part of the reason in which a county would do an IRB or would decide to put land on the table or to make infrastructure improvements. And recently those conversations have happened with some of our counties. So it seems odd, or I guess at best confusing, to hear this the way we've heard it, and yet our county officials haven't at least heard this as big a concern at the local level that it's talked about. So let's look at that first slide real quick, because the numbers, I know that we talked about this, or it was at least testified to at the last meeting, just to verify that the the numbers are right, and I do think that we all agree that the numbers are right. This is the information that came from the first task force that shows the breakout among the counties and the cities. But I do think it's important to recognize this is a snapshot. I mean, this is a moment in time, and it doesn't really tell the whole picture, which I think goes to some of the questions that have been asked is what are the other things that were factors? What are the other things yet to come that are in the pipeline? You all know as well that the juice doesn't get taxed until a certain point. It sits there for a while, and so in some cases that's not yet realized revenue, but it's actually already there in the barrel. So that's not necessarily reflected in these numbers. You've seen Bullitt County's numbers. I wanted to show you a couple of counties just to kind of put a face on some of these numbers, because you see these numbers on a big screen or a big sheet, and you don't necessarily see how they impact a particular county. And I would say that on these specific county sheets, just take note, these are only the county and the political subdivisions of the county. It does not include on these sheets the city or the school numbers. This is simply the county and its political subdivisions. So one area that we haven't really talked about much when you look at those sheets, and those sheets do not reflect this, and you all may know this, but just quick informational on how some of the county offices are funded. The sheriff's office, as you know, is a fee office. And one of the major fees that they use to operate their office is the commissions collected on taxes. So that didn't show up on that first sheet because it's a percentage of a number. And so we've included that. And in Nelson County, for example, that number for the sheriff is about $230,000 on commission income for collecting the tax. And that's a critical part of the funding of the sheriff's office in Nelson County. Never mind the $1 million to the county itself or the library or extension district. In real life example, I mean, that's 3 full-time positions plus other cuts on the sheriff's department in Nelson County. So just trying to put this in a little bit of perspective. If you look at the Marion County number, and you can see the information on these slides, I'm not going to read everything on there. But again, talking about the IRB issuance, the county issuing $682 million in IRBs specifically to provide that incentive. I talked to the judge there, and they've taken a few hits in doing really important things that they believed was important to help the industry be successful. Not everybody in the community thinks it's a great idea, and I've been there, when you do issue IRBs and you create this perception that we're giving tax incentives and we're giving tax abatement when not everybody gets that. And sometimes that's not always popular, especially in smaller counties. The judge there, in the court, took a tough position and closed a public road in order to help facilitate the growth there. And it caused some issues for the judge. And so, again, these are the kind of decisions that county officials have made and have invested in roads and infrastructure that don't always show up on just simply the distilled tax income side. And the third one there would be Henry County, a totally different kind of situation where you've got a county that today doesn't have a high dependency on the distilled spirits tax. But in 2018, 2019, when the conversation was happening about building these warehouses in their industrial park, the county went out and secured or made available 40 plus acres at below cost in their industrial park to help incentivize this. And part of that pitch, part of that selling point was that it would have the distilled spirits tax coming in to help offset some of that investment. And you can see some of these percentages. I didn't read them on the percentage of total property tax income that these mean for the counties. I think the number on Marion was about 12%, or 5% on it. Was Nelson, it was like 12% of the total ad valorem taxes that are collected. But in Henry County, they're expecting as much as $300,000, which obviously today you're not seeing those kind of numbers, but that's based on things that are already in the pipeline, not hopes and prayers, not if you do this we might, on things that are already in the pipeline to develop. So for a county like Henry County, this would be transformative. And Henry County, like Bullitt County, doesn't have an occupational tax. Henry County doesn't have an insurance premium tax. So some of these counties are heavily reliant on only the real estate property tax. Let me kind of bring it home with the obvious, and I hope my internal clock's working okay, is that I just think we want to say the obvious because I just don't want it to get lost. And I know Chairman McDaniel, I appreciate the role he has in the legislature and understands this as well as anybody. If the tax goes away, and I know this is a lot of hypotheticals at this point, there's just no other way to say it, but that it does put a hole in the budgets of our counties, our schools, our cities, our fire departments, our sheriff's offices. I mean, we just have to acknowledge that is the fact, unless there's something else. And I mean, at this point, and I apologize for not thinking about coming today with solutions, Representative McCoy. I thought that conversation maybe comes after you hear from everybody on the concerns. We'd be interested in having those conversations, but obviously the simple solution for us is let's don't bother this tax. This is a tax that many counties made decisions about. Hopefully, the industry made the decisions knowing it was there with no expectation it wasn't. At least that was the expectation at the time. And so if there are other ways to deal with that, that's totally your all's call, not as much ours. But it does create holes in our budgets if it goes away at this point. And the simple question is, who makes that up? I mean, Chairman McDaniel, you said, and I completely understand, that's not a hole that you would want to make up at the state level. I understand that. We certainly don't want to have to figure out how to make that up at the county level, because then we're just simply shifting that tax from who's not paying it to somebody else paying for it. And one thing that I think that maybe we haven't talked about, and it's a really complicated system. I never really fully felt like I understood it, even after almost 20 years of setting property taxes. But there is this kind of weird correlation between personal property and real and the 4% and all of that. And I certainly hope we'll be real careful in this conversation to make sure that if a conversation happened where the values decreased and actually literally came off of the books, that it doesn't unintentionally impact an automatic adjustment in the tax rate, because that action in and of itself could, as you all understand, when the values go down, compensating rate calculations the rate could actually go up to keep revenues at the same. Now, I realize this isn't taxed in the real property section the same way, but there is a convoluted formula on the property, on the personal property, that actually does have a bearing on the way that the real property rate is calculated. So again, I think we'd all want to make sure that in that conversation that it didn't unintentionally, automatically, immediately raise the rate on everybody else just by a simple reduction of it on the tax value or the tax roll. So if this is a task, or the task force and leaders believe this is an industry tax that shouldn't be paid, then I hope you'll look for ways to offset it in an impactful way, or in a way that doesn't impact us, if that's something that you all decide to do. That, again, for us is the simplest, least impactful approach for counties. So we look forward to continuing the conversation, and I will stop.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments. Senator Higdon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I've brought this up before, but just to put it out there, those that were here in 2014 that worked on this ad valorem tax understand the process we went through, that at the time we made a commitment to the bourbon industry to do away with the ad valorem tax through a tax credit. We made that commitment to the bourbon industry. We also, at the very same time, in a roundabout way, made a commitment to all the local taxing districts, cities, counties, taxing districts, school districts. We made a commitment to them to keep them whole by the way we set it up, where the bourbon industry paid the tax, the taxing districts received their money, and then on the back end, the state issued a tax credit for toward buildings, investment in buildings and equipment. We made that commitment then, and the reason we're here today and the reason we're talking about this, it's worked out very well when we had 4 million barrels of bourbon in the state. Now, as we approach 11 million barrels of bourbon, that commitment and that system is not working out very well. So, and in my particular district, half the world's bourbon is stored in my Senate district. So of the $30 million, basically $30 million paid in ad valorem taxes per year, $9 million of it goes back to $9 million is processed through 2 Nelson counties, $6 million to Marion County. So it certainly affects my Senate district, but this is important, and I guess I just wanted to give that little bit of history of how we got to where we're at. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Chairman McDaniel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To somewhat follow up on Senator Higdon there, and I like the chairman's admonishment that we ought to be looking for solutions, but I want to comment briefly on what solutions. Any taxation structure, a county's taxation structure or a corporate taxation structure or whatever it is a structure for a reason. And that reason is you've got to look at it as a whole. If you pick out any given tax, you can find your flaw in anything, very simply. I think to Senator Higdon's point, the General Assembly on behalf of the Commonwealth made an exceptionally generous contribution to a solution to help the bourbon industry in 14. And I think that I can say without fear of contradiction that nobody in here is going to raise their hand and say, oh, I hate my sheriffs, or I hate my schools, or I hate my counties, or I hate my libraries, right? On the flip side, nobody's going to raise their hand and say, oh, I hate my bourbon guys. We like both of them. But let's just be frank, and Mr. Henderson, obviously your voice reflected a degree of desperation, if I'm going to be frank, because the counties are very worried, and rightly so. But one side's, this is a fight. It's been picked. We can try to avoid that elephant in the room, but the fact is that's what it is. And I would encourage both sides as we look to solutions. Keep in mind, I do not view the Commonwealth's General Fund or Budget Reserve Trust Fund as either a salve or a solution to that fight. The Commonwealth has its own struggles. We still have terrible unfunded pension liabilities. We have largely gotten them under control, but we still have terrible unfunded pension liabilities. We still have issues in our state workforce wage structure. We still have a commitment to the people that we made just this last section to work towards zero income tax. And anything that hits the general fund or the Budget Reserve Trust Fund negatively impacts our commitment to 4.5 million Kentuckians. So as the sides try to find a potential solution, just know that I view that as not being an aspect to that solution. And so consequently, I would view with a great deal of skepticism any solution that relied upon that. But I do thank the chairman for his admonishment, and I think it's a wise one, and I appreciate everyone being here today.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Decker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to recognize my county judge, Dan Ison, and the deputy county judge, John Park, and my sheriff was here, but I think he's left. We have a great interest in this in our county, of course, but I understand that we just negotiated an IRB for the city of Shelbyville, I believe, but the county is part of it. There's an escape clause. I heard that question earlier about how many have escape clauses. It's a contract. You can write in what you want, but in ours, the one that's just been negotiated, if this bourbon barrel tax goes away, so does the IRB. Is that common throughout the industry? Is that new because of the threat of this going away, or do you know of others with this escape clause?
I would suggest that's probably a new qualifier,
Okay.
potentially because of this conversation.
Probably thanks to Judge Ison, but thank you.
President Stivers.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to. I practice law. I'm not an accountant, and I want to. I'm gonna call you Jerry, since if I said judge, 6 people would probably raise their hands out there.
Gotcha.
So, on the barrels, when you say they're capitalized,
Right.
and maybe somebody from the industry, first of all, I'm not talking about anything but the barrel. Right. No juice, no nothing. The barrel. Mm-hmm. You're buying 1 million barrels. I think you said maybe one company is buying 1 million barrels a year.
Right.
And that's a lot. What does a barrel cost?
I don't know right now. It used to cost close to $100.
$100 a
in
barrel.
17.
two or three now.
$200 a barrel.
Right.
So if you're buying 1 million barrels, you're paying $200 million a year for the barrels if you're that company.
Yes, sir.
And I'm going to just use Jim Beam.
Sure.
We can use whoever. So they're spending, and you're saying it's capitalized.
Mm-hmm.
So that becomes a depreciable asset, and you depreciate that over the period of time that barrel
RB.
will sit in the rick house.
Right.
And you can do the accelerated, you can do all the other stuff. If I were accelerated depreciation, or you can do straight line depreciation, you can, whatever. Is that so? That is a depreciable asset, and again, I'm going back 32 years to when I took accounting.
Sure.
That's a depreciable asset over the period of time that asset is in existence, and a useful asset. But actually, an asset can be depreciated and still be useful,
Right.
even though you've depreciated the value out of your system,
Yes.
which is a deduction on your, basically in your deductions and receipts. It becomes a deduction, whatever you're depreciating at.
Right.
So now, that is taxed at a totally different rate because it becomes a tangible asset. What rate is the barrel taxed at?
The barrel itself.
Yeah. See, and I guess that's a county by county.
And it is a county by county, and that's part of what Chairman McCoy, in your answer to all the IRBs. I'm not familiar with the rest of them. I know the one that's in my county. It's literally 90-something pages long, and I've read through it more than once.
You were on the other side when it was done.
Well, I was on the other side when it was done, but I'm not complicit to it. Let's put it that way. I never was in court or all that. So let's and we can chat about that because that's the way it is in our bond. So when you bounce back into it, the $545 million of which, on our side of it, when you go into the what y'all call personal expenses or the personal side of it, it's about $300 million. And you go to the $285 million on the property tax side. So that's just about the way that the bond is broken down, the best way that our CFO and folks have looked at it. And they have a pilot clause in there for the schools to make up the difference. And that's accelerated with the addition of each warehouse. And it was for like 15 warehouses, 50 to 58,000 barrel apiece, which is huge. It doubles our opportunities from $3.5 million to $7 million of revenue. And yeah, we're a county of 85,000 people. We still can't swallow it because we don't have an occupational tax. And you all heard me on that. I mean, they're self-insured, so they pay no insurance premium surcharge. We have no licensing and fees. And so,
and that
to help
becomes
you, Robert, no, I'm trying to help you here a little bit. I mean, I've got a full packet, and I would love to sit down and educate all 138 of you at one time. I had this discussion years ago on 2013 or 14 about the health of the industry and where we need to go. So,
But
yes, sir.
that gets in a bigger discussion on this.
Right.
So you, and I say you as Bullitt County, will have a totally different impact by the industry because I'm going to assume, and I was talking to the co-chair, Nelson County has occupational tax. It has other things like that.
Right.
So when you're, and Henry County doesn't. So when you're looking at impact of an industry and what it doesn't matter if it's this industry or any industry, you got to look at the full taxing structure about how's the barrel taxed? Is there an occupational tax? Is there no occupational tax?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what's in that? So it becomes a little bit different context from county to county how this issue, and I'm not saying there's a solution or not, but how this issue, based on my initial question, is you may tax the barrel differently than Nelson County taxes the barrel.
Yes, in the IRBs especially.
Okay, then the liquid is taxed differently also from county to county?
Yeah, it's
It's taxed at the tangible rate.
right.
Of the county, at whatever the county sets.
Right.
Okay.
And President Stivers, that was kind of what was behind my comment earlier. That again, when you've seen one county, you've seen one county, and if
Yeah.
all of these decisions if the taxes themselves, whether they exist or not, were determined by the county or the city or whatever, versus it being an across-the-board tax, or the rates and all those things, some counties might make the calculated decision that other counties would not make based on, as Chairman McDaniel said, the complexity of that particular county's tax structure. And so Simpson County, again, this is a go forward, not on Bourbon, but would make the decision to forego property taxes and do an IRB on an industry because we had an occupational tax,
Right.
and we were going to collect that. Another county might not make that same decision on the same two projects because their taxing structure isn't the same.
And that gets kind of back to when you look at this initial sheet, Jerry, that you gave us, $2.5 billion
Right.
For Bullitt, Marion, the rest of them are Nelson County. Are those all similar in duration? Are they all 30-year, 20-year, 40 years? Or are they different? Because, again, that would go into the calculation of the impact of the county, along with the other questions I've just asked about how the taxing structure impacts the county.
I would,
county.
yeah, and I would think so. I've never been involved with the Nelson County IRBs.
But yours is a 30-year.
Ours is 30 years. Yes, sir. It sure is. It was enacted in 2000. They started the conversation in 16. It was enacted in 17.
Almost all that I've seen are 30 years.
And President Stivers, my judge and sheriff both say they're 30 years for
Okay.
Nelson County.
I just want, okay, gives me a little bit more information. Thanks.
Thank you both, gentlemen. I got one clarifying question, and I'll pick on my sheriff over there, but I think you can answer it for me, Mr. Anderson. If you could back up to the slide that had Nelson County. Yeah, right there. Just to clarify, that $230,000 is already included in these other taxes, right? It's a percentage of what is okay. Thank you, Sheriff. I just wanted the public to understand it's not an additional 230, but when we're looking at where the money goes, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
That is an important clarification. But it's just blended, and you don't see it when you see just all those numbers.
Right.
that's the
So
reason we
for
pointed that
everybody's
out.
edification, the initial meeting, we had a chart that we put up. I think we sort of all agree that snapshot was as accurate as we could get it. It gives us a good idea. And included in that number is this revenue stream already for the sheriff. So it's not additional. Just kind of a basic question here. Understand the revenue is important. And I'm stressing that to you because we're here to try to figure it out. Is it important where the revenue comes from as long as it comes in? Is there any part of this where by golly, it's got to be a tax on those barrels or that spirit or this industry?
I can't answer for every county on what their personal opinion is about whether or not this should or shouldn't be taxed. And really, from a broad perspective, that's not our place. I mean, it's not a question. We're not setting tax policy by and large on anybody much, other than those entities that we do set the tax or have the power to tax ourselves. But I do think any model would have to include, and the one thing that, again, I think one of the members of the committee, I can't remember now, who asked about, could we backfill the other things that don't show up? For example, how much did the county put on the table in order to get something that's not included in the IRB? Was it a road? Was it a installation of a water line? All those things are different in every county. So whatever the expectation was based on a reasonable business decision that a county government or city government or whoever was involved in making the decision would have made, the model would need to fit as closely to that as possible. Because again, Henry County, how do we know what that's going to look like when we don't really have any historical data yet? So simply putting the number in that they have now it can't be the number. And so I think the short answer is, as long as it is based on the potential that number would have been, that probably most counties wouldn't care. But I certainly can't answer that on an individual county level. We haven't had that discussion yet.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, comments from members on the committee? If not, I think we're at the end here. The next meeting will be President Stivers. I do just want to make one kind of clarifying point. We tend to focus so much on the existing distilleries, and I hope folks see that the real impetus, and Mr. Henderson, this kind of was your opening comment. Boy, we haven't heard a lot locally about this. And the reality is, this is really something that I think impacts companies that aren't here right now, which is why you haven't heard from it. But what we're seeing over and over and over again, the Firestone family moved a big distillery to Texas. Rumor here in Frankfort is one of our locals is moving a big one to Indiana. And I'm talking a big, big, big one. It's that next step. And I just, in my heart, believe that Kentucky can be so amazing, but we have been so reactive in our history rather than being proactive. And I just keep coming back to my little town in Bardstown, Bourbon capital of the world, trademark, that we will lose that bourbon trail if we don't continue to bring in those new folks who are not in this room, who are not here, who are not yet impacted by this, and we're not seeing them because they're not coming because of this. So I hope you all see that. And the reason I'm saying that is as we look for creative solutions going forward, in my mind at least, there's a whole lot that says maybe there's a status quo and maybe there's a future. And if we could get creative there, I think we might see some common ground. So I'll leave you with that. President Stivers is up for the September meeting. Sadly, I won't be here, so I apologize, but I'm sure he'll do just fine without me.